As you guys are finding your seats, grab your Bibles. We're going to continue in our Mark series this morning, and we're going to be in Mark chapter 5, the first 20 verses of chapter 5. I know that now we are officially in Christmas time, Christmas season, whatever you want to call this, even though it's not technically like December yet, but it's the unofficial, official, although some of you have been in Christmas time since June, I think. But even though we're in kind of Christmas time, I want us to think back for just a second to the end of October, to Halloween, which I know is a weird way to start anything. Let's think back to Halloween. But at Halloween, there is something that a lot of people do that I do not participate in, and it's like every TV station has their 30 days of scare-a-thon, whatever you want to call it, all these kind of horror movies that folks watch over and over again. And that's just not something that I partake in. It's not something that I enjoy. But a lot of people that I work with, and I'm sure there's a lot of people out here that really enjoy all of the great kind of horror films that are out there. But if you've noticed within the last few years, we'll say maybe the last 10, 15, 20 years, there has been this kind of overarching kind of attention and focus on a certain type of horror film. We don't get very many like kind of slasher kind of things anymore. Most of what we deal with now, like I remember we went to see a movie earlier, and they had all of these previews for the stuff coming up in October, and one of them was like a remake of The Exorcist. You have all this like The Nun things, all this kind of spiritualized, kind of demonic type horror films that seem to be all the rage these days. This is what people are making. This is what people are watching. So as we look at chapter 5 this morning, that's kind of what we're looking at here at the beginning. This is the closest that I could say we might have a horror film in the Gospels. It is a pretty dramatic event. It's a pretty drastic event as we go through this. And as I said, I'm not a huge fan of these types of movies. And so unless we were going through a book verse by verse, which we try to do, and I was having the choice, I would have skipped over this and I would have gone to the next passage because I've already preached on that one and it was really good. It's something that's a little bit easier to get across. But as we go through these verses this morning, I hope that you can see like no story, no kind of remembrance of what Jesus has done is in any of the Gospels for no reason. They are all in there for a purpose. They all have value in it. And so as we look through this, hopefully we can see in our own lives how much we actually share in common with this man that encounters Jesus. So let's read through these first 20 verses here, and then we will dive into them. Mark chapter 5, verse 1 starts. They came to the other side of the sea, to the region of the Gerasenes. As soon as he got out of the boat, a man with an unclean spirit came out of the tombs and met him. He lived in the tombs, and no one was able to restrain him anymore, not even with a chain, because he had often been bound with shackles and chains, but had torn the chains apart and smashed the shackles. No one was strong enough to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always crying out and cutting himself with stones. When he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and knelt down before him. He cried out with a loud voice, "What do you have to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I beg you before God, don't torment me." For he had told him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." What is your name?" he asked him. "My name is Legion," he answered him, "because we are many." And he begged him earnestly not to send him out of the region. A large herd of pigs was there, feeding on the hillside. The demons begged him, "Send us into the pigs so that we may enter them." So he gave them permission, and the unclean spirits came out and entered the pigs. The herd of about 2,000 rushed down the steep bank into the sea and drowned there. The men who tended them ran off and reported it in the town and the countryside, and people went to see what had happened. They came to Jesus, saw the man who had been demon-possessed sitting there, dressed in his right mind, and they were afraid. Those who had seen it described to them what had happened to the demon-possessed man and told about the pigs. Then they began to beg him to leave their region. Verse 18, as he was getting into the boat, the man who had been demon-possessed begged him earnestly that he might remain with him. Jesus did not let him, but told him, go home to your own people and report to them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you. So he went out and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and they were all amazed. So as we look into these 20 verses, we may not do like necessarily a deep dive into them, but what I want to help us see this morning is kind of a few overarching ideas about what this story is representing for us. The first one is that as we look at this, we come across a man who is demon-possessed. And from this and from the story of what we see here, we see that there's an enemy that is actively against us. See, we come to stories like this, and like I said, most of the time we want to kind of skip over them. We want to minimize them. We want to explain them away. We want to say that this man probably wasn't demon-possessed, that he probably just had some sort of psychotic break, that he was schizophrenic, that they just didn't have the medical knowledge at the time, and so they threw it up into demon possession and eventually ran him out of town because they didn't know what to do. But I think as we read through this, you can see that we really don't have that option to say that this was just some sort of mental health issue, although those are real and valid. But this here, what we see is demon possession of an individual, which was apparently prevalent at this time during Jesus' ministry, at least. But I also don't want us to say that was back then, this is now, so it has no meaning for us either. If we look at what we think as we go through this, too often we kind of end up in one of two camps. And you may have heard this quote before, but C.S. Lewis at the beginning of his book, The Screwtape Letters, puts it this way. He said, there are two equal and opposite errors into which our race can fall about the devils. One is to disbelieve their existence. The other is to believe and to feel an excessive and unhealthy interest in them. They themselves are equally pleased by both errors and hail a materialist or a magician with the same delight. So as Lewis puts it, we tend to fall into one of two camps, whether we either deny the spiritual realm entirely and say that these things do not exist, there's nothing there, we don't worry about them, we are only focused in on the physical, material aspects of our life, or we go to the other extreme and we are basically consumed by thoughts of the spiritual realm and especially of demons. And to the point where we see demons in everything, we see demons through everything, to the point where one of the commentaries that I was reading told a story of a church that had started, and they kind of got too far into this, and they ended up, ladies were in the backyard, like tearing up a set of like drawers because they felt that the demon was in them. So we can go one of two ways. But what we're going to try to do this morning is to kind of thread the needle, kind of go this narrow way of acknowledging that these things are real, that these things exist, that we have interaction with them at various points in our life, but to understand that we are not controlled by them, we should not be afraid of them, and that we serve one who is far greater than them, and we're going to get to that in just a minute. But the first thing that we want to see is that we have an enemy who is actively against us. If we look at the description of this man, we can see how terrible this is for him and for the people in this area. If you go back to verse kind of 2, we'll start really in 3. The beginning of this description is that he lived in the tombs. No one was able to restrain him. He had been bound multiple times, but through some sort of supernatural strength, he's able to break the chains that bound him. He was able to tear the shackles off of him. No one was strong enough to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs, he lived in the tombs, and he was crying out and cutting himself. This man has been tormented. This man has been pushed far outside of any normal bounds of society. And so as we look at this, I think there's kind of three ways that we see, three categories, a little bit more words than that, but three ways that we're going to kind of see how these demons are attacking this man and how Satan and his subjects still attack us today. And the first we see here is that this man becomes isolated and alienated. Isolated and alienated. Isolation and alienation are one of the first tools that our enemy can use against us. This man was obviously not always like this, right? He was not born demon-possessed, but at a certain point in his life became that way. And I'm sure that it was a mild kind of thing that began slowly as people began to notice how differently he acted, the things that he was saying, the things that he was doing, and they probably tried to help him. I'm sure that we would do something very similar, but over the course of time, his actions became more and more outrageous and egregious, and eventually he ends up living in the tombs outside the city. Now, as Jesus went across the sea here, as we see at the beginning, this is not necessarily a Jewish area, so we don't know if this man was a Jew or a Gentile. Probably a Gentile, the best that we can kind of assume. But if he was a Jew, no Jew would live amongst the tombs, because living close to dead people, you're not supposed to touch a dead person as a Jewish person. You become unclean when that happens. But even if he's a Gentile, and even if we think of it in this day, like no one in their right mind is going to live at the graveyard, right? Live in this situation, live kind of separated from everyone and in this area. And I'm sure at this point, or by this point, people know who this guy is, that they are telling people to avoid this area, do not go into this area. There's a man there who is out of his mind. And so in this, he becomes isolated and alienated. And really, if you think through this as well, if we read this, the only maybe interaction that he's had with people recently are folks who come to shackle him and to bind him, maybe with the intention of helping him, to keep him safe, or maybe to keep them safe. We don't know. But the only interaction that he has with people are those that come to constrain him, not to do anything extra, not to help, not to feed, not to clothe. In fact, in Luke's gospel, we see that he actually runs around naked through this whole time. And so we see him being isolated and alienated in this. The second thing that we see that Satan brings against us, that these demons are doing in this man's life, is to bring destruction upon who he is as a person. So if we take the description of what we see in Luke of him running around naked, if we look at this, it says that he is night and day in the tombs on the mountain. He is always crying out. And that's a real mild version of what this word actually means. If you look at it, the idea here is that he is actually howling out. He is screaming and howling. He's running around, hurting himself, doing all of these different kind of things. And in that, he is basically the idea that Mark tries to get across here, and you see it in the other Gospels too, is that this man is almost more animal than human at this point. He's living off of his base instincts. He's just responding as the demons are tormenting him. He's in this area, like I said, completely isolated from everyone else. And so in this, we see that Satan, through these demons inhabiting him, is tearing down what it means to be a human. He's becoming just like the animals around him, and that is exactly what they're going for. You see, overarchingly, what our enemy wants to do is to destroy the image of God that we are created in. And that's what he's doing here when this man is howling out. He's not in his right mind. He's going about all of these different things, totally separated from the community that's around him, totally destroying, or we'll say almost totally destroying, what it means to be made in the image of God. To be made in the image of God is to be in community, to reflect back to God who he is, to reflect to those around you who he is, to have kind of a moral compass or a moral kind of sense about you, to have this understanding that there is more to this life than just what we see around us. And yet this man has been isolated. He's been alienated from God. And now he is just acting upon base instinct, going about his days as though no one else matters, no one else is there, as though God doesn't exist. And lastly, we see, if those two aren't bad enough, this kind of isolation, this kind of destruction of who he is, we finally see that he is really utterly hopeless. And we see this really coming out of, the whole story. Just think if it's such an interesting verse that said, or sentence, that no one was strong enough to subdue him. No one can help him. There's no one out there who is able to do anything for him. And that leads to all of this other kind of stuff. And at the very end here, this idea or this statement of him cutting himself with the stones in the tombs. Now, when I was kind of prepping for this, I didn't realize that the kids were going to be in the room with us. So I'm going to try and be as tactful as I can. But this man, whether commentators are kind of divided on what he's actually doing here, whether he's trying to, in cutting himself, to release the demons from him, or if he's trying to take it to the ultimate extreme and end his torment. We don't know exactly. I think we can probably see that it's maybe more of the second one than the first one, because of what we see that the pigs do. Because the hopelessness that comes from where he is has left him no alternative but to seek to take care of the situation himself. He sees no avenue out, and I there's folks in here that have taken counseling and therapy courses and that kind of stuff and know a whole lot more about this than I do. But from personal stories that I've heard of people who have taken these things into their own hands, who have inflicted harm on themselves, it's because it comes from a place of complete and utter hopelessness. They have no option. They have no recourse. This is the only thing that they can see before them, just to either feel something or to end something. And that's where this man is at. This man is at the end of his rope, and he's ready to be done. He doesn't care how it's happened. He doesn't care how it happens, but he just wants to be through the torment that he is being inflicted with. Now, as we go through this, I know that this man is an extreme example of what it means to be afflicted and tormented by Satan and by the demonic forces. But I think if we look at this, we can ask this question: have you ever felt isolated or alienated from those around you? Have you ever felt that you're in such grip of sin that you're just responding out of instinct instead of logic and love and hope? Have you ever been at the point where you are just ready for everything to be over with? You see, this man was indwelled by demons at this moment, and for those of us that are in the room who are believers in Christ, that's not really an option for us, thankfully. But we can still be afflicted. We can still be tormented. We can still be attacked by these spiritual forces that are around us, and we can go through the exact same thing that this man has experienced. And that's a terrible place to be. I've been there multiple times in my life where I have felt utterly and totally helpless and hopeless. I've felt totally alienated and isolated from the people around me. So I think if I've done it, you've probably done it. And I think what we need to see is that though these things attack us, this is not the end of the story. Because we see another person come into the situation. We see that Jesus overcomes all opposition that is faced here. It's really interesting if we look down at verse 6. He says, when he saw Jesus coming from a distance, he ran and knelt down before him, and he cried out with a loud voice, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God?" This demon answers the question that Matt ended his sermon with last week. If you look back at the end of chapter 4, verse 41, it says, "And they were terrified, the disciples, and asked one another, 'Who then is this?'" The next words that are spoken in the literary story, and you even see that Mark actually flips the encounter here so that the demon speaks first instead of Jesus telling him to come out. But the next words spoken in the story are, "Jesus, Son of the Most High God. What do you have to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God?" This is really, really interesting that after the disciples seeing what Jesus could do to the storm and the waves, they don't understand who he is. And yet, in this instant, this demon who's confronted with Jesus knows exactly who he is and calls him such. And he doesn't come and kneel down before him because he's worshiping him, but he comes and kneels down before God, before Jesus, because of the authority of Jesus himself. He calls him, obviously, Son of the Most High God. He is calling who he is and showing the authority because of the position that Jesus has. Now, there was a superstition in this day when you were dealing with spiritual forces like this, that if you could name the person, if you could give them the specific and actual name, you would have authority, you would have power over that other being. And that's what this demon is trying right here, probably more so for the other people around him to hear that he's calling him Jesus, Son of the Most High God, in a vain and futile attempt to enact some sort of power over Jesus. But as you can see, as we continue to read through these verses, that this demon who is inside this man actually has no authority over Jesus. In fact, he can't do anything until he asks permission of Jesus to do what he wants to do. So not only do we see the authority of Jesus and just who he is by his own innate personhood, his own innate deity, but we see the power that Jesus has over this being, and it is total and complete authority. They beg him, the one who has been tormenting this man now begs not to be tormented. And this one who has been indwelling this man after being told to come out doesn't want to leave. Obviously, that's what they want to do. And instead, he asks to be sent into these animals, these pigs that are there. And I think we can see the fact that the pigs immediately run into the sea and drown. That's the end goal of this demonic force, is destruction once again. And we can see that very clearly because they immediately go and they immediately are destroyed. But in this whole encounter, we see not just kind of the power and the authority of Jesus, but we see the mercy of Jesus as well. One of the things that stood out to me as I was studying this is that Matt made the point last week that it was Jesus' idea to go across the ocean, the sea, right? It wasn't the disciples. They didn't have any concern over there. Jesus goes across the sea because he knows that one man is demon-possessed on the other side. They brave the storm at night. Jesus shows his power over creation and that, but he goes across the sea so that this man who is possessed by a horde of demons can be freed from that enslavement. And so in this, we see the mercy of Jesus. And unlike this man right here, we know that if this is at the beginning, just a few short years in the future, Jesus is going to do a much greater display of his mercy. If Jesus has control over the demons in this situation, do you not think that when he walked down the road, carrying his cross up the hill, that he had any less power and authority in that situation? He willingly went to the cross as the ultimate display of his mercy. This man, infested with demons, had no reason to expect freedom. He did absolutely nothing to call Jesus across the Sea of Galilee to come and free him. He had no way, he'd been living in the tombs, he had no way to repay what Jesus had done for him. You and I have done absolutely nothing to deserve the unmerited grace and favor of Jesus displayed in his death and in his resurrection. He died on that cross, taking the penalty of our sin, and then in his resurrection, he is declared victorious over all things, the demons included, and especially the demons. If he's victor over sin and death and the grave, he is victor over all powers and principalities. Jesus overcomes everything in our lives and in the world around us. And so finally, we get a really interesting conclusion to this story. So I enjoy reading, we were talking about this at an event last night. I enjoy reading fantasy books. And one of the great things about, not all fantasy books, but a lot of them, like you get this whole kind of journey towards an end where good versus evil collide, good and light always wins. And a lot of books, then it just kind of like ends. We don't get a lot of like the after story. So somebody was giving me a hard time about Lord of the Rings last night. And that is a great book. It's a great trilogy. And one of the great things about it is that there's a whole bunch after like the ending that you get to read in that. You get to see how this kind of follows. And then if you're even more of a nerd like myself, you read the appendices and you find out what happens even farther after that. And it is just like, it's the best thing in the world. And what we see here, a lot of times in the stories that we see about Jesus, is that he heals the man and Jesus moves on, and that guy, we don't ever hear about him again. Or he gives this man sight, and then what happens? We don't know. But this story, we actually get an ending. We get kind of a follow-up. There's this almost, for someone who's been tormented by a devil or by these demons, we get almost this kind of comedic meeting between Jesus and the demon, because there really is no comparison. Jesus overcomes, this man is freed, and in fact, when the people from the city come out to see him, he is described as sitting, which he's been running around the tombs for however long, so now he's seated. He is dressed, and he is in his right mind. And the people were actually more afraid of this man as a sane person than they were of him as a demon-possessed person. And I think that's because, as one commentator put it, when people are more afraid of what Jesus will do in their lives than what Satan does in the moment, they often push Jesus away. And so instead of welcoming Jesus, celebrating what had just been done, they say, "Would you leave? Please leave. We don't want you here." Which is such a weird reaction. You would think after you have seen this man, demon-possessed for years probably, now come and is in his right mind, dressed, seated at the foot of Jesus, you would say, "This is amazing. This is the best thing I've ever heard. It's the most amazing thing that I've seen." But they are maybe more concerned about the pigs that died than the man that was saved. And they say, "We need you to leave. We don't want that kind of stuff around here. But what we do see is this man who, as Jesus is getting into the boat, and it's interesting, Jesus doesn't stay where he's not wanted. That is probably another sermon, but I think it's important for us to see that. He gets into the boat and leaves. And then what does make sense is that this demon-possessed man begs earnestly that he might go with him. If you've been changed, if you've been altered, if your life has been completely overcome by the power of Christ, you're going to want to stay with him. This makes total sense that this man says, please, please let me go with you. What doesn't make sense is then what Jesus says. Because if we're still at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, correct me if I'm wrong, anybody, this is the first person that actually wants to go with Jesus. All the rest of the people we've seen in Mark so far are called by Jesus. Jesus says, come follow me, and they get up and they follow him. This man says, Jesus, I want to go with you, and Jesus says, no. Which is weird because we would think Jesus is wanting a following, right? Jesus wants to build followers. He wants to build a team or a group. And what better example of what Jesus can do than a man who was consumed with a legion of demons and is now free of those. But Jesus has something different planned for this individual. Verse 19, Jesus did not let him go, but told him, go home to your own people and report to them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you. So in this instance, we see that Jesus gives changed people a mission to go on. He doesn't say, come follow me. He says, go and tell. The folks in this area did not want Jesus there. And so Jesus leaves a representative of what he has done in the area. And he says, go and tell these people what you have done. And it's what has been done. How much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you. And then he does it. Now, it does say that the people are amazed. It doesn't say that people believed in Christ. So we don't know what's going on there. But we do know that Jesus gives this man a mission, and this man does the mission. And in the same way that Jesus has given him a mission, Jesus gives us a mission. Now, your story might not be as dramatic as being filled with a legion of demons and being freed from that. But I think all of us can say how much the Lord has done for us and how great the mercy is that he has shown towards us. You don't have to have a fantastic, thrilling testimony, a fantastic, thrilling story to tell people. What you get to tell people is that you were a sinner, lost, separated from God, bound for hell, and he came into your life and he changed everything. I know a lot of us in this room might think our story starts with, well, I grew up in church. That's no less valid than any other story. Because sometimes those church people are the hardest ones to change, right? When we have been delivered from the isolation and the destruction and the hopelessness that we face in this world, that is a story to tell. And that's the story that we get to tell. And all we have to do is say, this is what God's done for me. This is how God has shown mercy for me. Let him show mercy for you. Let's pray.